You've heard me say it before, and there's a better than good chance you'll likely hear me say it again. I love sleep. It's just the best. There's nothing in the world that quite compares to that bliss that comes from rest. The world may let you down, people may let you down, but your bed will never let you down. I should probably actually say about 99.9% of the time your bed won't let you down, because there was actually one instance in my life where my bed did let me down. But if I'm being realistic with you, it wasn't the bed's fault that it let me down. Let me explain. You're kind of wondering where I'm going with this, I can tell. I was still pretty early in my journey as being an owner of an air mattress. In fact, it was actually the second night that Mandy and I actually owned our first ever air bed. And we had kind of noticed as we went to bed that night that the mattress top was a little bit off from the bottom part of it. I can't call it a box spring because it's not a box spring, it's just a box. But we noticed that it was just kind of slightly askew, and so being the responsible bed owners that we are, that's a weird statement to make, right? Responsible bed owner. We decided to try to push that top mattress back in order to be able to line it back up, and then we went to my favorite place in the whole wide world, Dreamland. It was fantastic. But the next morning when I woke up, I awoke with a sudden realization that something was wrong. Have you ever had that before in your life where you wake up and nobody has to tell you something's wrong? You just know something's not quite right in the world. I realized that the bed was now suddenly a whole lot firmer than it was the night whenever I went to bed. Apparently, during the course of the night, whenever Mandy and I had pushed that mattress back up, we had actually disengaged the hose that helps to regulate the air in the bed, and over the course of the night, it had completely deflated. And I was now lying directly on top of the box, not box spring, but box, which was made up of very hard plastic. I also had the realization that I could not move. Every single time I tried to make a movement, I had incredible, intense pain. Apparently, the lack of support for it caused my back to revolt against my whole body. And I could not, in any way, shape, or form, move. Now, I'd hurt my back before, but at this point in time, I'm in my early 20s, or mid-20s, I think, at this point in time. And every time I'd hurt my back, I did one of two things. I either stretched it out until it stopped hurting, or more often, I just ignored the pain until it went away because I was in my 20s and there were no consequences. But this was such a severe pain that it caused me to have to do something that we never thought I would ever have to do, or at least at this point I never had to do in my life before. I needed to see a chiropractor. And the problem with that is that Mandy and I were still really, really early in living in the place that we were living in at that point in time. We had just moved there not too awful long beforehand, and so we really didn't know where to get started on finding a good chiropractor. So my loving and beautiful and amazing wife did the only thing that she could think of. She grabbed the phone book, she turned it to chiropractor, and just started calling numbers. And every time that she called an office, she would relay to them exactly what was going on, that her husband was in such severe pain he could not move, that he had just lost all support, and he needed somebody to come and adjust him, or somebody to be able to just see him in order to make this better. But every time she called an office, they didn't really seem to be too sympathetic or care much about where I was. Some of the offices that Mandy had called said, well, in order to see him, we're going to need to make an appointment, and we're booked up for weeks, so we can't possibly see him today. Some of the offices said that in order for them to adjust me, that first I'd have to go in and they'd have to take some x-rays, and then they would have to evaluate those x-rays, and it would be 2 or 3 days before they'd be able to give me any sort of an adjustment. 1 or 2 of the offices actually even went so far as to say, unless you have health insurance, we won't bother to touch you. And we had health insurance, but it hadn't kicked in yet. So we were kind of left wondering what to do. Finally, after a couple of hours of Mandy calling different chiropractic offices only to be told no, she finally reached one that listened to her when she said her husband was in so much pain that he couldn't move, one that actually listened when she said that he needed to be adjusted and he needed it today. And they told us, well, just get him in here. They said, we're not going to worry about x-rays, we're not going to worry about any of this, we're just going to worry about relieving your pain to kind of get him moving again. And they told us finally that you can come in whenever you can get here, which was great because, again, I was not moving. At this point in time, I had laid in that bed wide awake for a couple of hours while my wife had been calling different chiropractic offices. And finally, whenever they said, just get him in here, whenever you can get here, we'll adjust him, that was a good thing because I wasn't moving real fast. Mandy finally, with some effort, helped me to finally stand upright, and without any exaggeration whatsoever, I nearly blacked out from it. I was in that much pain. We got me dressed in some semi-passable attire. I'm pretty sure sweatpants were involved, but sweatpants are awesome, let's be real. If sweatpants were totally acceptable by everybody, I'd be in sweatpants right now. Crescenda really likes that idea. We finally get me dressed, and I make my way out of the house, and again, without exaggeration, it took over an hour to finally get me from our bed upstairs to down the stairs, out the door, and in the car. Every single movement I made sent lightning throughout my entire body, and once we actually started moving, the slightest of turns, the most minor of bumps in the road, and even just the softest touch of the brake made me wish I was dead. I was in that much pain. I really thought that this might be the end. We finally got to the chiropractic office, and again, after what felt like an eternity of getting me out of the car and getting me into the building, they just didn't even have me stop in the waiting room. They just said, go on back to this examining room and get laid down on that table. So I got down there, I laid down on the table, they gave Mandy all the appropriate paperwork to fill out for me, and within minutes, then walked the doctor, all 5'2" and 110 pounds of him. The only thought I had was, I don't think this is going to work out very well. The doctor started asking me just a couple of questions. He wanted to know about where my pain was really kind of centralized, where the hub of it was really taking place, and kind of how I felt in that moment. And I could tell that as I was answering these questions that he was fully engaged with what I had to say. He had a look on his face that didn't just say, I feel sorry for you. It was a look of, I'm going to do what I can to help you. Finally, after asking those questions, he said, and I'm never going to forget this, he says, you're a big guy. So at least I knew this guy had a firm grasp of the obvious. And he said, I know you don't believe this, but I specialize in big guys. 5'2", maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. Whatever you say, buddy. He had me place my right leg over my left and keep the knee bent, and then he told me to kind of shift my weight as much as I could to the left, and every single time I did, that lightning bolt went through that body. Every little movement finally hurt, and as he finally got me into the position that he wanted me to go to, he said, ready? And before I could even process that he had said the word ready, from my vantage point, it looked as if he had climbed on top of the countertop and flew through the air, landing his entire body weight on top of the leg that he had me put down. It sounded like firecrackers were going off in the room. Mandy's eyes got as big as dinner plates. And before I knew what had happened, he switched my legs around, got me into the same position, and did it again from the other side. And even more firecrackers went off in that room, just pow, 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 pow. And then as the chiropractor stood up, his face sweaty and beet red, he threw his arms up in a moment of proclamation and said, I am the king of cracking big men.
It actually happened.
And then he told me to stand up. Now let me remind you, up to this point, every single movement I had ever taken that entire day had done nothing but cause me pain. And so the idea of standing up in that particular moment was so far-fetched for me that I could not understand it. We were well into the afternoon. It was at least 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And at every moment of this entire day, any movement whatsoever caused me pain. But the doctor told me to stand up. As I began to kind of maneuver myself out of this weird position that he had me in, easily the most graceful of poses I'd ever been in my life, I made another realization. It didn't hurt anymore. As I stood up for the first time, fully upright that day, it was as if my entire body had just relaxed. The pain was completely gone, and in its place was the thing I had been looking for all day, the one thing that I had wanted that entire time, the one thing that we had called so many chiropractic offices looking for, only to be told, no, we can't make this happen for you, until finally we find one guy who has enough compassion about what's going on in my situation that he brings me the one thing I truly needed that day: relief. But as much relief as I felt in that particular moment after having an entire day of having severe back pain, I can't help but think that it pales in comparison to the relief that the woman in our narrative today felt. We're going to be in Luke chapter 13, so please go ahead and get turned there or open up your Bible apps towards it. This is kind of one of those little moments in Jesus' ministry. This is one of those narratives that's so easy for us to read and just move beyond because it just kind of happens and then the narrative keeps going. But in Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 16, we read about this particular thing that's going on, a moment of relief for a woman who desperately needed it. Luke doesn't really specify where exactly we are in this narrative, which if you know anything about the book of Luke is kind of unusual for him. See, Luke as a doctor is very detail-oriented, and so very often throughout his narrative in the life of Jesus, he makes sure to pinpoint exactly where we are and in what town this is taking place in. So the likelihood is that either there were conflicting reports of where this story took place, or Luke just didn't know but still wanted this narrative to make the cut. But Luke does tell us that we're in a spot that's kind of normal for us. He mentions something in passing that is easy for us to overlook and miss. Because in verse 1, which starts off as a sentence fragment, he says, as he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. Jesus is in the midst of one of these little scenes that we have seen play out so many different times in his ministry. We're all too familiar with this sort of thing. He's teaching in a local synagogue. And I want to pause for just a second because I think that sometimes we kind of miss a very important part to understanding the Jewish faith that takes place in the life and the ministry of Jesus. A synagogue is not the same thing as the temple. Far too often, I think, especially in our culture and our context of having no real frame of reference, we just hear the word synagogue and we immediately assume temple. But when we talk about a synagogue, we're talking about essentially a satellite for the people of that particular town to be able to have a spot to go and gather and worship. The temple itself refers to one specific location in the city of Jerusalem. But if you live in one of the hundreds of towns outside of Jerusalem, the idea of going to the temple every week for services is a little bit daunting. Because in some cases you would have to walk for days in order to finally make it to the temple. And so they set up these synagogues as, again, little satellite areas for the people of that town to gather together to worship. Think about it like this. This is probably a terrible illustration, but it's the illustration I'm giving you. Don't you just love it? If you go into a Kroger or a Target or something, occasionally you'll find one of those little tiny Starbucks coffees. It's like a little tiny Starbucks there. It doesn't have all the amenities or all the things that the big Starbucks actually have to offer you, but it's there. A synagogue doesn't have all the amenities of the temple itself, but it does offer a spot for the people to be able to walk within a reasonable distance to gather together as a community in order to worship and to learn and to find out more about their particular faith. So Jesus is teaching in the midst of one of these synagogues, and it's kind of the same picture that we see all the time when it comes to Jesus. People are gathering in the synagogue on the Sabbath to hear from him. Some maybe there are hoping to be healed by him, and then those pesky Pharisees and other religious leaders are trying to get rid of him. But then Luke, in verse 11, kind of shifts, and he points out something that stands out in this particular narrative. There's a person here who's had to deal with a terrible condition for a very, very long time. Verse 11 says, a woman was there who had been disabled by a spirit for over 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. A woman in this particular town had been dealing with her own back issues for a very long time. She was bent over, completely unable to stand up straight at all. If you've ever experienced any kind of back pain or back issues, then you know what it's like to just want so badly to just stand up straight, to just be able to stretch in a way and just kind of find that relief. Maybe you felt that back pain in just some of the silliest of ways. Maybe you reclined in a chair that you weren't supposed to, in a position that you shouldn't have, and you stayed there just a hair too long. Maybe you got that back issue because you tried to do something silly, like a buddy called you up and said, hey, can you help me move a piano? I love you, Andy. Maybe you've had those back issues in some way, shape, or form, but you know what that means to want so badly to just be able to relieve yourself of this minor pain that you have. This woman has been dealing with this, though, in that shape, in that position for 18 years. 18 years of not being able to just stand upright. 18 years of every time she moves into a certain position, she feels nothing but excruciating pain. 18 years of not being able to just look people in the eye when you have a conversation with them. 18 years of not being able to sit or recline or go to sleep in a comfortable position. 18 years she has dealt with this excruciating back pain, just trying to find some way to find relief. But let me step back and we can take a look at the little bit of a broader picture here. See, because it's entirely possible, given the time period that we're in, that this woman grew up in this town, that she has lived here her entire life, that she has gone to this synagogue every week for her entire life. She is a part of the fabric of this community. And so 18 years ago, whenever she first started developing these back issues, I'm going to guess that some people probably noticed. Some of the folks that she gathered together with, or some of her friends and neighbors, noticed that she's not able to stand up straight, that something's wrong with her. And they probably felt sorry for her. They probably felt some sympathy for her. But now it's been 18 years. Let's be real here, folks. That sympathy that they felt, that desire to try to help her in some way, probably faded within a couple of months. Now, it's just part of the background. It's part of her life. It's part of her presence in the community. Because 18 years is a real long time. It's possible now that whenever somebody new shows up into town or somebody comes to visit or something like that, they may see her and they may ask somebody, hey, what's going on with that lady? But at this point in time, the answer is just simply, oh, that's just old Donna or whatever her name was. That's just the way she's always been. This woman for 18 years has lived with this condition of not being able to get comfortable. And while people may have felt sorry for her to begin with, at this point, whenever she might complain about it, people maybe are just annoyed by it. It's part of the fabric of what it is. But then, Jesus sees this woman, and when he sees her, he knows exactly who she is. He knows exactly what she's had to live with. He knows exactly what could possibly bring her the best relief possible. Jesus is moved by compassion for her. But his compassion stirs within him a desire to do something about it. A desire to help her find relief. Verse 12 says, when Jesus saw her, he called out to her, "Woman, you are free of your disability." Now, can I just say for a moment here, I love that Jesus said the word free. Because if you've ever lived with any sort of back pain for any period of time, it's like you are confined to one position that you can't possibly get out of this idea, and yet Jesus tells her, you are free. And she is indeed made free. Verse 13 says, then he laid his hands on her, and instantly she was restored and began to glorify God. In one moment, in one encounter with Jesus, in one particular instance, she goes from hunched over, in pain, unable to do anything about it, to stretching, to being upright, to finally be able to look out and see the people that are around her, to see more than just their feet, to finally be able to look at the people in their eyes without pain. Can you imagine the relief she must have felt in that moment? Can you even process the notion of 18 years of having to live with this? I spent a whole day hunched over like that, and I thought this was the most relief I would ever feel in my entire life. This woman spent that way for 18 years. And in this one encounter, as she's able to finally position herself in a way that, I don't know, is actually comfortable. Relief washes over her. And of course she begins to glorify God. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't in the midst of all of this? Her friends, her neighbors, her entire community are able to see this woman whose condition has made her just part of the background of this town, to finally see her in a new light, to be able to see that relief that has come over her. It's incredible. It's moving. It's inspiring to those around her. But there's always got to be at least one fly at a picnic, right? There's always got to be at least one thorn in the side. There's always got to be one jerk in the crowd. But in this instance, the jerk is somebody who probably should have been right there alongside her glorifying God. We read about it in verse 14. It says, "But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath," shameful, responded by telling the crowd, "There are 6 days when work should be done. Therefore, come on those days and be healed, but not on the Sabbath." Now, we've spoken about it before. I'm not going to give you a whole big dissertation on it again, but the Sabbath had a lot of rules to it, and a lot of things that you could and could not do during the Sabbath period. It was supposed to be a day of rest. And so this synagogue leader, who would essentially equate to being this woman's minister, her pastor, is upset, not because she's healed, but because of when she's healed. Jesus has no problem giving this guy a probably bitter pill to swallow and kind of putting him in his place. He says in verses 15 through 16, "The Lord answered him, 'Hypocrites, doesn't each one of you untie his ox or donkey from the feeding trough on the Sabbath and lead them to water? Satan has bound this woman, a daughter of Abraham, for 18 years. Shouldn't she be untied from this bondage on the Sabbath day?'" See, while Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, which wasn't exactly kosher, that's a fun word to use there, which wasn't exactly part of the traditions of what the Sabbath celebration was, Jesus was so moved by compassion for what this woman has had to deal with that he didn't want her to have to wait one more day. He saw the pain that she was in. He knew exactly how rough the last 18 years of her life were. And he said, "Not one more day." It didn't matter to Jesus that it was on the Sabbath, because what was more important in that moment, what stirred Jesus' compassion in that moment, was for this woman to find relief. His love for her, his compassion for her was so moving. He points out this synagogue leader was putting his priorities in the wrong spot. He's pointing out that this synagogue leader loved the law and loved tradition a whole lot more than he loved this woman. This man had no compassion for her. He did not celebrate with her. Instead, he moaned over a tradition being violated, than a woman who was worthy of compassion finally finding it. We have a tendency in the church to act an awful lot like that synagogue leader. We have a tendency within our walls here to sometimes not be moved by the compassion of those around us who are struggling or hurting or wrestling with something. Again, this man saw this woman for 18 years struggling with this particular condition. Even if he wasn't there that long, even if he'd only been in that particular synagogue for a couple of years, he still knows who she is. He probably knows her whole story. If anything in the world, this guy should have been right there beside her, glorifying God, praising that the Lord had finally relieved her of this pain that she has dealt with for far too long. Had he had even the smallest amount of compassion for her, that would have been more important. But instead, his priorities was all kind of out of whack. Instead, he was far more upset that Jesus happened to pick the wrong day on the calendar to finally relieve her of this pain. Compassion is not the same thing as feeling sorry for someone going through a rough patch. Compassion and sympathy are not the same thing. I'm willing to bet that most of this town was still sympathetic towards her in some way, shape, or form, but none of them were so stirred by compassion to try to offer her relief. And yeah, we could go ahead and say that they probably couldn't give her the same relief that Jesus did, right? I mean, unless one of them was a chiropractor. They probably couldn't give her that same kind of relief, but they could have tried something. They could have found ways to make other areas of her life a little easier so that way her burden wasn't so heavy for her. At the very least, the synagogue leader could have prayed constantly for her, asking God to finally relieve her pain. But he had no compassion for her. It's so easy for you and I to get wrapped up in things or we place too much emphasis on stuff that we forget that at our heart, we are meant to have compassion for those around us that we see struggling. You and I encounter pain and struggle and hurt and strife every single day. But can I ask you, how often are we actually moved by it? How long is compassion stirred up within our hearts for that? At the very least, if there's one particular place where we should be most compassionate, it's right here. If there's people we should feel the most compassion for, it's the people that we gather together with every single Sunday, every single week that we call our brother and our sister in Christ. If we cannot be moved in compassion for them, then who could we possibly? And yet, far too many churches have no compassion. Even for those who sit across the sanctuary from them, who sit down the aisle from them, who maybe sit right next to him. Compassion should stir us. It should stir us to see the struggle that someone is going through and to do whatever we can to offer them what they really need most: relief. The church should be known as a place where compassion isn't just a part of what we do. It's something that overflows all around us, that we are literally tripping all over each other to try to serve one another, to try to bring relief for one another's pain. Our compassion for each other is born out of the love that we share for one another. Without compassion, there can be no real unity amongst us. We've been talking about unity for months now. You're probably getting a little tired of hearing the word unity. I'm fine with that. But without compassion amongst us, this is essentially just a glorified board meeting that happens once a week. Without love, there can be no compassion. And without compassion, there can be no real unity in the church. You and I are called by God to be people of compassion. To not just see the hurt and the suffering and the pain that goes on around us, but to be moved to the point that we do something about it. Because whenever Jesus, our Lord and our Savior, the one that we are trying to model ourselves after, whenever he encountered pain and suffering and hurt, he didn't just say, "Oh, that's a shame," or "Oh, I feel so bad for them." He had genuine compassion for them. And that compassion stirred him to do something that you and I can do on some level. We may not be able to miraculously heal people. I don't know, I'm not going to put restraints on the Holy Spirit. Maybe we can. But at the very least, we can do whatever we can to offer what they really need most: relief. Jesus said in John chapter 13, 34 and 35, and we'll close with it today. He said, "A new command I give you: love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another, and by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another."
bensound.com